could not understand spoken questions. He could understand questions if you sang them to him. I came in, I sang the question, he would answer the question.
Today on Time We Discuss, I have Samantha Foot with me, and it's time we discuss what it's like to be a music therapist. Samantha, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on. I'm excited.
I'm excited too. I know very, very little about music therapy, so we're just going to jump right in. What does a music therapist actually do, and what is your day typically like?
Music therapy is taking music and working on non-musical goals using music functionally. So we work on communication skills, motor skills, social, emotional, cognitive, all those different things. And I work with kids and adults with autism mainly. I also, they have ADHD, any type of neurodivergence, I work with them. And then my company also works in like addiction recovery, eating disorder clinics, mental health facilities. There's also music therapists in hospitals, in prisons, in bereavement. They're everywhere, in schools, a bunch of different places. So people are really surprised by that when they find out about music therapy. So I just like to put that in there. So a typical day is going to different people's homes to do music therapy sessions and or going to my clinic space and doing music therapy sessions. It just depends where they want to have it. Sometimes their home is the best place, sometimes the clinic is the best space. And then I just work off my treatment plan that I made from doing an assessment with them. And we typically do sessions for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, or 60 minutes. And I'm just using their preferred music and working on their goals. So that's what my day is.
So, do they also have? I'm assuming like a preferred musical instrument, or are certain instruments? Do they work better from a music therapy perspective than other instruments, or it doesn't matter? What's that like?
It really does not matter. I typically use percussion instruments and a guitar, ukulele, something like that, just because it's more transportable than using like a piano. So if they have a piano in their home, then we can definitely use that. I have a keyboard that I can bring, but they're not as mobile as a guitar or something like that. And so I typically just use percussion instruments and a guitar. My son is really frustrated with me because he plays a baritone and I don't take a baritone to people's homes with me. And he says that I need to. But really, I could use it. I could use a baritone, but it's not very mobile either. So
That's a bit of a hefty instrument, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So the instrument does not matter. It's all client preferred. Like some clients don't really like the sound of certain instruments, so we don't use them. And then it depends what the client's working on. So I have a client that's working on using her hands in a pronated position. So just, with your hand down. And the piano is perfect for that. And so I bring in a piano and it's not piano lessons. We are just playing on the piano, using her hands in that position. And if she learns how to play the piano while we're doing it, then that's great, but that is definitely not the goal.
Okay, so let's hang on that for a second. How important is it for you as a music therapist to have a music education background or a strong music background if you're not actually teaching them how to play, so to speak?
I got a master's degree in music therapy, and in order to be a music therapist, you have to be board certified and you have to get at least a bachelor's degree in music therapy. And that's the actual degree name. You can't like get a degree in music education and be a music therapist because you do specific classes for music therapy. But I bring in so much musical knowledge into what I'm doing with the clients that it's definitely important to have that background and have proficiency in your instruments and know about music so that you can use it in a functional way.
Okay, that makes complete sense. Now, I was talking to Christina back in 2024. She was a speech pathologist, and we talked briefly about having the bachelor's degree and a master's and how far you could go with speech pathology having either of those degrees. So you mentioned having a bachelor's in music therapy, but there's also a master's in music therapy. Are you limited in what you can do if you just have the bachelor's versus if you pursue the master's?
No, it just, they were talking about having a master's level entry, so you had to have a master's degree to become a music therapist, but they decided not to do that. And so if you have a master's degree or a bachelor's degree, it doesn't really matter. I mean, obviously, if you have a master's degree, you have more knowledge, but Having the bachelor's degree, you can do the same jobs as if you
Okay.
had a master's.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, before we started recording, we talked briefly about it sounded like your current position, you might be like a 1099 kind of employee. It sounded kind of like something like that, where if you don't work, you don't get paid kind of a thing. How common is that versus being like a salaried position? Do you have any idea?
Most music therapists have to make their own job. So I started my own business, but I do have employees, and these employees get sick time and PTO and benefits and all of that. So those jobs do exist. But I would say, from just anecdotally, from what I've seen, you're usually a contractor or you own the business.
I spoke to Zachary Layden. He has a horse business essentially, and one of the things we talked about was that day you get your first employee. Because I gotta imagine that's got to be very scary. At least for me, it would be. What was that like hiring your first employee to work for your business?
So I started with contractors, so it was a little bit different. And I just grew too much to where I couldn't do everything myself. So I hired a contractor, and then she was like, I need to be an employee or I'm going to leave, basically. So I said, okay, we're going to make you an employee. And then we just kept growing. So it's scary though, because I never really thought about it, but my mom one day was like, you're responsible for people, like you're responsible for their livelihoods. And that freaks me out. That if I don't get payroll done, then they don't get paid, they don't have a livelihood. And so that part is kind of scary, but it's also super cool to have a team where you know that you can have people to help people do what they need to do, if that makes sense.
That makes complete sense. That
Yeah.
reminds me of I think it was when I spoke with Ashley. She's the owner of Dasha Social, which is a social media marketing company. And if I'm remembering the correct person, said a very similar thing. Like, now you're not only responsible for yourself and your family, now you're also responsible for someone else and possibly their family too. So I can only imagine. Can only imagine.
Yeah.
So you talked about working with kids. You said you also sometimes work with adults. And again, when I was speaking with Christina, she talked about using speech pathology. I always thought it was just with kids. I thought it was like, the traditional speech class. And she said, no, no, no. Also, she works with people that had strokes, for instance. So my question for you, do you ever encounter instances like that, or is it strictly working with neurodivergent people?
I mainly work with neurodivergent people, but I used to work with people who had strokes, dementia, Alzheimer's, all those kinds of things. I just don't specialize in that anymore, but there are music therapists that do that.
Now, do you need a special certification to do that, or is just more of a no? This is the preferred people you work with?
You don't technically need a special certification, but there are classes that you can take. There are different continuing education credits that you can get to further be able to specialize in that population. So, for example, like right now, if someone says, will you go work in this prison system and do music therapy? I would say no, because I don't feel comfortable knowing what to do with that population. But if I took the classes, I took the continuing education credits, then I'd be like, oh yeah, for sure, I can do that.
Now, I've heard of art therapy as well. In what instances would someone pursue a music therapist versus an art therapist? Or it's just a matter of preference?
I think it's just a matter of preference and the modality that you use.
I've also heard of creative arts therapy and expressive arts therapy. Are they the same thing? Are they different? Do you know?
I'm not sure if creative arts or expressive arts is different. I know that when you use those things, you can use music, you can use dance, you can use art, all the different like expressive modalities you can use, but you're not technically like an art therapist or a music therapist. So you just use those more generally than if you were like a music therapist. But I did look into getting a doctorate in expressive therapy, and then being a music therapist that is also trained to use the other modalities, and I think that would be super cool. But my husband told me no because I do too many things. So
You talked about continuing education. From a music therapist perspective, what does that look like typically?
So we have to get 100 education credits per 5 years. You have to recertify every 5 years. To become a board certified music therapist, you have to pass a board certification test, and then you have to do certain credits that meet the criteria for being a continuing education credit. And then, yeah, you just renew it every 5 years, and sometimes you get audited. So you want to make sure that you really do what you say you're doing.
That makes complete sense. Okay, so I was speaking with John. He was a mental health practitioner, and we talked about the challenges, at least in his field, going between states and keeping the certification. Is the certification for music therapists at the state level, or is that at the national level? How does that work if you treat someone that's in a different state?
The certification is a national certification, but they do have licensure in different states. So I'm in Idaho. Idaho has no regulations on music therapy, which is ridiculous, but so they're not protected. But if you go to Oregon, they have licensure. So I cannot practice in Oregon unless I get a license in Oregon. But I can practice in Utah because Utah doesn't have licensure. It just depends if the state has licensure or not.
Okay, okay. And in this day and age, do you do any virtual therapy, or is it all in person?
We can do virtual. Most people prefer to do in person, but we do have a couple clients, like we're in Boise, Idaho, and there's a couple clients that we have that are a couple hours away, and they do virtual therapy because there's no music therapist in their area.
Now, I meant to ask you this earlier. We were talking about different musical instruments. What about the voice? Do you ever do anything with vocals when it comes to music therapy?
Oh yeah, for sure. We sing a lot. I had this kid who said he didn't like his monotone voice. And so I'm like, your voice is fine the way it is. But he's like, no, I want to work on being more expressive. And so we actually practice singing in expressive ways in different styles to help him get used to having more expression in his voice. And so that's not the only thing we do, but we definitely use singing. For kids who aren't speaking, you can sing before you can talk. So singing is a great way to help them speak. And then the goal is for them to maybe hum a melody and then they speak. They don't speak, they sing the words and then they say the words without singing. And so, yeah, we use the voice a lot.
Do you ever work in tandem with other professionals? So my mind immediately jumped to like a behavioral therapist, for instance. And if you have someone that's nonverbal, do you ever work alongside these other professionals where they do some things and you do some things? What's that? What could that be like for you?
Yeah, I've worked with behavioral therapists, I've worked with occupational therapists and speech therapists and physical therapists. So it I'll give you an example. I worked with a speech therapist who was working with a client who had hydrocephalus, and he could not understand spoken questions, but he could understand questions if you sang them to him. And so I came in, I sang the question, he would answer the question, and then we slowly backed out the music because the music was making new neurological connections in his brain. And so slowly those neural connections were able to just handle the spoken language. So we slowly backed up the music and then he was able to answer questions that were spoken to him.
I'm blown away by that. When I was in college, I remember writing this paper on I forgot what it's called. There's a nerve, there's a bundle of nerves that goes between the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. And I think it was back in the 50s or 60s, they did this procedure where they would sever this connection I think it was to treat people with seizures, I think.
Yeah, with epilepsy.
Yes. Okay. And they did these experiments where they would like show the people a picture of one thing, but then ask them to say it or something like that. Or they would show them two different pictures, I think. And the takeaway was, they would see something but say something else. And it was just so fascinating. And what you just described reminds me of that, where it's like they can understand the question if you sing it, but if you speak it, they can't. That's the brain is so fascinating. That's incredible.
Yeah. If you
Wow.
want to see a really cool music therapy, very public music therapy journey of healing and kind of like that. Gabby Gifford, who got a traumatic brain injury, she had her speech centers obliterated. Someone shot her in the head, but she did music therapy along with speech and occupational and physical therapy. And she credits music therapy for speeding her process along because music affects more of the brain at one time than any other stimulus. And so it's able to make those neural connections and access part of the brain that maybe is damaged. And then you can make new neural connections so that you can connect those things and be able to do the things that you were able to do before.
Let's talk about finding a music therapist. Does someone need to? Does a I'm going to call them a patient, for lack of better words. Do,
Yeah.
do they need to know to ask their doctor for one, or their advocates need to know to ask the doctor for a music therapist? Would a physician recommend a music or art therapist? How does that referral typically happen?
I have had doctors refer patients to me, and that's super cool because a few years ago that did not happen, and now it's happening. So that's super awesome. I typically get clients through the Medicaid system. So when you're diagnosed with autism, ADHD, any of those things, you have the option of applying for a Medicaid waiver that pays for music therapy. And so I'm on a list, and then the support brokers, the case managers, like all those people that help the patients with their plans, they will refer me. And that's typically how I get patients.
If someone doesn't have Medicaid, Medicare, or something like that, but they have private insurance, does that ever cover music therapy from your experience? Never, sometimes. What's that like?
It depends on the state. So in Idaho, it is not covered, but in other states, it is covered. And I would say it's not very often that it's covered. And if it is covered, it takes the spot of speech therapy or occupational therapy, like it's counted in your visits toward that. And so a lot of people don't want to use it for music therapy. So the big answer is no, don't plan on using your private insurance, but but you might be able to. It just depends on your state.
One of the things I like to ask the people I'm speaking with, if someone is transitioning to this career later in life, what is a good path for them? I'm pretty sure it sounds like they need to get a degree of some kind in music therapy. It doesn't sound like there's any kind of shortcuts around that. You can't just like do like a on the job training or something like that. Is there any other path they can take, or no, they need a degree?
If you have a degree in another field, you could possibly get a master's level equivalency. And so if you have, especially if you have like a music degree or a psychology degree, you could get a master's level equivalency so you don't have to do a full bachelor's degree again. And then I would plan on you have to do an internship, which is at least 6 months full time. And then you have to do practicums during your schooling. And I would plan on that. It's like an hour once a week for 2 years. And well, that's what I did, but you have to do like 4 practicums. So it is very intensive to get a music therapy board certification, and there's really no way around it. Like, if you already have a degree, though, I don't recommend going back and getting another bachelor's degree. You might as well get a master's degree. And you can do that online. So that's kind of cool that you don't have to, like certain programs, they do it online. But yeah, there's no way around the degree. You have to
Okay.
get it.
So in doing the 6 month internship, how is it based on amount of hours? Like you need to complete so many hours during that? Is it possible for someone that if they're already working a full-time job that they could also do an internship? Or is like, no, that's there are enough hours in the day to do that? What would that be like?
I would say you probably couldn't have a full-time job and do the internship, but I had a part-time job. I worked 20 hours a week outside of my internship. So I was working 60 hours a week, and that was doable. I didn't have a family at the time, so I don't know if that's doable with a family. But yeah, so I would plan on not working full-time unless you're going to completely burn yourself out.
Samantha, one thing I like to do whenever I'm speaking with someone is give them an opportunity to talk about a project they're working on, a cause they believe in, some more about their business. So if there's something specific that you'd like to discuss, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you. So I started Boise Music Therapy Company in 2013, and we have grown it to include other services that I'm super excited about. So we do behavioral therapy, and then we also do parent consulting because I noticed that parents, like I was working with the kids, and then the parents didn't know how to really parent their neurodivergent kid. And so now we do parent consulting where we have a community. Parents can get into that and they can have support. I've noticed in the neurodivergent community, if you're raising a kid who has autism or ADHD, it's a very lonely road. And so you need that support, you need that community where you can come, ask questions, you can vent, you can do the small wins that people might not think of. So, for example, my daughter played with someone on the playground. I have 3 kids that have autism, and my daughter played with someone on the playground. I was so excited. And if you talk to someone who has neurotypical kids or typically developing kids, they're like, whoop-de-doo, who cares? But that's an exciting thing if your kid never plays with anyone. And so we also have a parenting program. It's a parenting course that uses positive parenting strategies. It's built on 3 pillars: positive parenting strategies, mastering your own self-regulation, and understanding neurodivergence. So we talk about like sensory sensitivities and communication differences, motor differences, all those different things that you might not think about if you're a neurotypical person, or like autism, ADHD is very genetic. And so you might be autistic, you might have ADHD, and your kid has it, but you were never diagnosed. And so you don't understand, like, oh, yeah, that's why I feel that way. That's like part of neurodivergence. And so that's what we go into. And then I also have a podcast called Every Brain is Different. And we just talk about neurodivergence. We talk about positive parenting strategies. So if anyone wants any information about that, they can go to everybrainisdifferent.com.
That is awesome. So many great things you're saying over here.
Yeah.
So one, I was talking with Holly Faust. I spoke with her back around Halloween. She is actually an occult researcher. I finished editing her video just a few days ago. That goes live in about 2 weeks, I think. So if I'd recommend people listening to this, go check it out. It's a good one. But she actually talked about she is neurodivergent and she was diagnosed as an adult. And it was really cool. I got to talk to her about what was that like? Did things like all of a sudden make sense to you, or was like more denial, or what was it like? Really, very cool. And kind of like what you were saying too. She has I think more than one kid. And I believe all of her kids are also on the spectrum, if I remember correctly. So it's very interesting hearing that. And I hear what you're saying about the small wins too, and like playing on the playground and stuff like that. We have, I know a number of people, their kids are on the spectrum, and it's high functioning, low functioning. So I hear what you're saying. Those wins can just be they get you. They get right here.
Yeah.
Samantha, you said so many awesome things. I'll make sure I get those links from you. They'll go in the show notes. They'll be on the website. They'll be all over the place. So when people are trying to find you, they can easily find you. Thank you again for being on Time to Discuss, and we learned what it was like to be a music therapist.
Thank you.